Hi, good morning, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on the location from where you are joining in. My name is Kuldeep, and I'm your host today for this 3-hour session on SQL Azure. We'll be discussing about multiple things in here. So, without any further ado, let's get started with our session, everybody. So we are talking about most of things, and in today's session is dedicated for advanced learning with the SQL Azure, talking about the SQL Azure databases. So this is your host Kuldeep in the class, and I welcome you all depending on if you're joining us from Zoom meeting or LinkedIn Live, YouTube Live, Facebook Live, or other streaming media channels. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let's get started with our session. So in today's session, talking about the agenda, we would be talking about what's my Azure SQL overview, what Azure SQL is, what different components do we have in there. On top of that, some of the top level concepts which we will be discussing as part of our today's demonstration. We'll be having intensive demos, 10 different demonstration talking about each and every aspects of SQL Azure. We will be having Q&As in between, question and answers in between, while we'll be working up with that particular sessions. Talking about the same thing, let's understand the very first topic, which is talking about SQL overview. We are understanding what SQL overview is. So as the name suggests, it is a service hosted at Microsoft Azure. And when we talk about what is my Azure SQL database, it's a fully managed platform as a service component. It's a database engine that handles most of your DBMS functions, such as upgrading, patching, backups, monitoring, fine-tuning without any user involvement. So it's completely managed by Microsoft in terms of automated backups, patchings, and monitorings with fine-tuning as well. So when you talk about Azure SQL database, we can create a highly available databases and of course a high performance data storage layer as well for the applications and solutions which are you're planning to deploy on Azure. Depending on that, you may have some use cases with you. You might be having some of your on-prem resources already available with you, looking to migrate them. So when you talk about how can you migrate, we can have different aspects of those migrations. I can go and create it as an Azure SQL VM. We will be discussing a little bit about that. I can go ahead and then opt for SQL Azure. That's going to be my platform as a service resource over here. I can go for a SQL managed instance as well, which is also a platform as a service resource. The first option goes infrastructure as a service compute mechanism in here. So we will be discussing all these things and some more important demonstrations as part of our today's learning. Going further, let's understand what's my Azure SQL database services. What different services do we have available? I can have SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine. If you want to migrate your existing SQL Server workloads with ease of maintenance, complete compatibility, and the OS level access as well, pretty much full control of your database day-to-day operations, you should be opting up this one over here. This is our infrastructure as a service model, compute options from Microsoft. I can go ahead with my Azure SQL managed instance as well. When I talk about managed instance, it gives you roughly 99% compatibility as you're on any of your on-prem database services. On top of that, this is a platform as a service component from Microsoft Azure. Having said that, Microsoft's taking care of the automated backups. Microsoft Azure takes care of automated patchings, having the fine tunings over there, providing recommendations over there, taking a lot of workloads off the table, what you used to do with your on-prem situations down there. And on top of it, it also providing you most of the compatibilities, and it's good choice if your applications requires operating system level access down there. We can go ahead with Azure SQL databases here. When I talk about that, it definitely support all of your modern cloud applications. It's an intelligent platform as a service solution. So this comes up as a platform as a service engine, which comes up over there. And it's fully managed service, which Microsoft manages. And you can deploy it in a older DTU model, a virtual core model. You can also deploy it on serverless mechanism. We will be discussing about it. I can go for Azure SQL Edge. These days, a common term, I would say an interactive term known as edge computing is quite famous when you talk about edge computing options in there. So you can extend your applications if you have some IoT solutions, you have Internet of Things solutions over there. And when I talk about IoT solutions, you have IoT devices. You may have existing IoT hubs over there, which is on Microsoft Azure provisioned one. You can have IoT edge devices as well deployed and analyzing the data near at the source. You can have your IoT central as well. You can have twins categories over there, IoT device twins over there. So all these IoT related operational databases, you want to have Azure SQL Edge functionality over there. Microsoft's offering that as well. So our today's session is majorly discussed on this big guy over here. We will be talking about Azure SQL Database a lot. What is a platform as a service component? How do we provision that? How do we start using it? High availabilities, disaster recovery, data security, query fine tunings. We would be discussing a lot of things today in our today's session. Having said that, guys, let's get started with our next topic. So few more minutes which I'm explaining in terms of a theoretical demonstration. But once again, our today's session is power packed. 98% of the session will go with lots of demonstrations, practical implementations, and best practices. So in Azure SQL, what are some of my top level concepts? Let's take an example. When I talk about some top level concepts here, one, it is fully managed. I'm talking about Azure SQL Database, which is my platform as a service component that's fully managed by Microsoft. We will practically see that. Provides you flexibility in terms of cost, in terms of compute, depending on the use case. Sometimes you want dedicated database systems with a dedicated compute, ideally optimized for having HPCs, high performance compute operations to be done over there, handling lots of transactions. When I say millions of transactions with dedicated compute, sometimes you want a cost effective solution for your dev or test use case scenarios. We talk about the hyperscale storage. We'll be discussing. You have the support all the way from storage up to 4 terabytes up to 100 terabytes as well. Even more than that, you can go for those options in there. SLAs, Microsoft's providing up to 99.995% SLA when it comes to pricing tiers over there. You do have the functionality of auto scaling there. I can scale it automatically whenever the resource demands are there. So that's a great feature with most of the cloud providers provides. But the beauty of Azure SQL here, Microsoft gives you auto scaling, couple of seconds, you set up your rule and you're good to go without even restarting the services and anything like that. Moving with the advanced data security. Sometimes we want to achieve transparent data encryption. We want to achieve dynamic data masking in my database world. And how do we do those operations in our Azure SQL Database, which is a platform as a service component here? We will be discussing about intelligent pricing in terms of how your SKUs, your stock keeping units should be decided in order to get the maximum out of Azure pricings, what Azure's offer. So let's talk about some of the deployment models, and still we are talking about SQL Azure, important thing, my platform as a service deployment. I can go with a single database deployment. This is a largely usable approach, ideally recommended when you want a database with a dedicated compute and storage. I can go with the elastic pool mechanism as well. That's a fine balance between performance and costing that can reduce cost drastically if I'm ready to share those resources among different databases. And depending on your business use cases, you might want to choose an appropriate deployment model over there. So these were some of a brief example of Microsoft Azure SQL service over there, some of the deployment modes we discussed. Now we are getting ready with some of our demonstrations now, guys. So almost 2.5 hours during the time we will be discussing lots of demos, lots of demonstrations about Azure SQL, which includes 10 different practical demonstrations using the use cases down there. We will be discussing about how do we create a SQL database server using Azure Portal, technically the provisioning of my SQL database server or the deployment of my SQL database server. How do we work and create a blank database, a sample database, databases within the elastic pools over there, understanding the concept of SQL elastic pool. How do we work with our firewall settings? Why does it required? Why anybody would like to have the firewall settings, except making it accessible for some specific IP addresses, the Azure Services Communications. Then we will be discussing Azure AD, which is your cloud authentication directory over here, the cloud authentication authorization service. How do we integrate Azure AD with our SQL Azure? We will be discussing about working with auditing with the SQL Azure platform as a service component down there. How do we work with the SQL Azure application, even if we want to configure Geo-Replication across multiple regions? How do we do that? What is the costing impact and what kind of SLAs Microsoft provides in there? We will also be discussing about working with dynamic data masking over here, which will help you securing your data. There are often times when you don't want the sensitive information should be visible to the users. So depending on their roles and accessibility, I want those information to be masked. For example, email address, the credit card informations, the CVVs, the ATM pins, any kind of sensitive informations, passwords you store into the database servers, those should be masked for the regular users except the administrators. Talking about query performance insights, we will be discussing what QPIs, query performance insights in SQL Azure. And as I told you earlier, this is going to be a power-packed session with all these practical demonstrations, what we are covering for just one component, that's my Microsoft SQL Azure. To be specific, my platform as a service component in Azure in here. Great. So we are starting up with our very first demonstration for the day, guys. We are talking about deploying an Azure SQL Server on using the Azure portal. How do we do that? Let's take an example here. In order to do that, I'm gonna deploy that. So let me go over here and let me quickly open my browser and I'm gonna bring it here. That's my incognito. Let me go to portal.azure.com. I'm logging into my Azure portal. Let me go with my credentials here. That's the one which we are using today. Let me have my credentials entered. So I'm going to my Azure portal and we will be doing all these demonstrations, what we discussed. So at the end of the session, you will definitely feel confident in order to work with SQL Azure databases, various operations, use cases, and all those best practices along with that. So currently I am in this particular portal and what I'm doing beginning for the very first demonstration here, let me click on the resource groups and I'm going to create a resource group here. Let me do that. I'm with my corporate directory here and the resource group I want to create is my workshop. And that's what we are doing for a SQL Azure platform as a service. That's going to be the name what I want to kick in. Let me have my nearest region selected here, review and create, and I am creating this resource group. So if you take a look over here, we just created our resource group in the Azure portal, and by end of the session you can expect at least 10 to 15 different resources provisioned over here. SQL servers, multiple SQL servers, databases, Geo-Replications, accessibility within the apps over there, query performance, and all those things in there. So Let's take an example here. It's an empty resource group. My first demonstration talks about how do we provision our SQL servers, and I'm talking about Azure SQL Server. Okay, before I go ahead and start creating that SQL Azure database there, let me show you something. I'm on my whiteboard and let's understand a basic scenario. Let's say on the left, I'm talking about how it usually works in on-prem situations. And when I talk about the on the right, I'm talking about SQL Azure, and specifically I'm concerned about platform as a service option over here. So let's take an example. Usually in my on-prem cases, either you're going to have your database server on a physical server or inside a virtual VM, whatever that is. Let's call it a server. So you do have a server here, which could be physical, and that could be a VM as well. And ideally, this server is going to have some compute associated. Let's take an example. This is 64 cores over here. And plus, I'm talking about 786 gig of RAM. And that comes up with the 20 terabyte of storage. That's the compute which we have aligned with our on-prem server. On top of that, what additional things do you usually have? You have the operating system associated over there. Then you have SQL Server installed, whether it's your standard edition, whether it's your enterprise edition, the web edition, whichever you're installing on top of that. For both of these components, what additional costing is involved? You do have a server cal. So I'm going to have my server license. And on top of that, I'm also going to have the client access licenses, both for the operating system as well, for SQL Server as well. And once these things are done, you can create as many databases as you want. Of course, depending on your compute, you can have multiple databases created on your on-prem SQL Server. And having said that, when you usually do that, you might also want to enable replication, SQL Server agent jobs, plenty of things. This is a typical scenario when we talk about an on-prem implementation. So ideally, when you talk about from the stakeholders perspective, from managers perspectives, if you want to consider the cost associated with that, usually my cost goes with my SQL Server here. So I have a SQL Server which I am running. It is having some compute associated. It's having some licensing cost. It's having some electricity consumption, the cooling cost over there, and we can analyze all those things down there. When I talk about SQL Azure and I am talking about SQL Server, so in platform as a service, the first component here also I am talking about SQL Server. The first thing I want to tell you guys over here, the costing of a SQL Server is absolutely $0, nothing. Zero costing over here for provisioning a SQL Server. So in on-prem situations, you analyze your cost with your database server at the server level with the operating system licensings and all. At Azure, it's a platform as a service. The cost of a SQL Server is absolutely zero. You're gonna see that. Let's go to my Azure portal. What I want to provision here, let me go for a SQL Server. And I'm not talking about VMs or databases. I'm talking about SQL Server platform as a service here. Let me create one. And when I'm creating a SQL Server, our first option, our first demonstration, what we are talking about is analyzing the cost. So this is my subscription. This is the resource group where I am deploying it. Okay, the name of the server, let's call it, that's my GTL SVR number 61. That's the database server which I am provisioning right now. I'm doing it at my East US. The server admin login, let's say I'm specifying this user with the password which I will be using later on to log into the server. Important thing, I can provision it from the portal as well. I can provision it using Azure CLI as well, PowerShell as well. I can do it using ARM template as well. We have lots of details. In my next demonstration, I will talk about networking firewall rules, what that yes no stands for. As of now, I just specified what's going to be my resource group, the name of the server, the location, the user ID, and the password. That's it. And I'm saying review and create. And one important section I want you to take a look over here that tells you the estimated cost is absolutely nothing. It tells me no additional charges. So that's what I was talking about. If you want to provision a SQL server, which is platform as a service, the cost here is absolutely nothing. What if I want to provision 5 SQL servers here? It's still gonna be nothing. 15 SQL servers here, still gonna be nothing. Okay, we'll take a look. But I'm not able to provision that SQL server. And if you will see that validation, it's going to tell you, hey, you're not authorized to provision your SQL server in this region. And sometimes you may get this error. And I can tell you one thing, there are two possibilities why this error is appearing like that. One, you don't have permissions. Number two, you do have the permissions, but your resource provider are not registered. In this case, I'm the account admin, so I'm having a global admin role. Permissions never an issue. So let's see what was the problem. If I go to my subscriptions, let's go to your subscription, and down there you will see something called as resource providers. If you want to use some functionality in Azure, those namespaces has to be registered. I'm looking for Microsoft.SQL, which is my platform as a service. That tells me it is not registered right now. All I'm doing is clicking on this register box and it will start saying registering over here. If you want to provision SQL virtual machine, that is SQL Server infrastructure as a service, you have to register this one as well. In our case, it's optional, but anyways, I'm doing it. If you want to go for open source RDBMS systems like Postgre or MariaDB or MySQL, you have to register them as well. If you want to work with the alerts and notifications, for example, make sure you're registering this as well. So every namespace in Microsoft Azure comes up over here. In your case, 99% cases, it might have already been registered by your administrators, by your tenant admins. But to give you a heads up, you were seeing that error. If it's telling you you're not able to provision in this region, you might have some policies, but when you try changing regions and it's simply not allowing you, and you are kind of admin, have the permissions there, the next culprit's gonna be your resource providers are not registered. Since I submitted them for registration, now I'm trying to create a SQL server. Let me go over here. That was my GTL SVR number 61, the name which I was using. East US is where I'm provisioning it. Let's go for GTL admin and the password. Let's go over here. I'm gonna specify the same password here. And let me provision this server now. That tells me absolutely fine, no problem, no errors, because I registered those resource providers. Let me click on create over here. And I am creating this SQL server. I am deploying this particular SQL server. So if I take you back to my PowerPoint presentation, it was talking about a demonstration. How do you deploy a SQL server using the Azure portal? But I want to extend it. I want to show you some advanced scenarios as well. So currently I deployed one SQL server, a logical container in East US. I want to deploy another over here. Let's say that's going to be my UK South. I want to deploy a third one as well. Let's say that's going to be somewhere on Central India or Japan East or wherever you want. All right. Why do I need it? So that I can later on use them for geo-replications, multiple things, pricing differences. We can talk about regional level changes, the latency kind of things. How does it appear? So let's go in there. It is deploying one. In the meanwhile it does, I'm starting a next deployment here. Let me create another SQL server. I want to call it GTL SVR number 62. Ideally, it should be a meaningful name. I'm just using it just for demonstration purposes. Let's go over here. This time I want to deploy it on my UK South. Let me select that region. Okay. Coming back to my credentials, You can use same, you can use different. Just for demo purposes, I'm using the same credentials, so it's easy to remember. Ideally, that's completely up to you. You may have different credentials here. Okay, what I'm doing next, on the networking section, I'm saying, well, number 62, Azure services will be able to communicate to this server. I will tell you the differences. I will tell you the problems, if it is no or if it is yes, with the best practices little later on. Whatever you do, when you say review and create, still no additional charges. I'm deploying a second SQL server. Let me click on create over here. And I started the deployment of number 62, which is going to be UK South. Okay, it is submitting that deployment over there. In the meanwhile, let me go to my SQL servers area again. I can see 61's already deployed. It is available. The location is East US. Let me create one more with the same subscription, same resource group. Can they be on different resource groups? Absolutely yes, no problem on that. All right, let me go here. I'm saying that's going to be my GTL server number 63. That's my database server, which I am creating. And this is going to be hosted somewhere at Central India, for example. Let me go over here. And I'm looking for a Central India location. I can specify Asia Pacific. That's a different region altogether. Let me go with the credentials here. And now I'm creating the third one with the default settings, and let me provision that as well. It will also go for the deployment. So what I've done so far, I've got 3 Azure SQL servers, which are platform as a service, and they are at different regions, currently costing me nothing. So at this step, at this point of time, whenever you have these costs are considered, that's costing me 0. As far as the cost is considered, it's technically nothing. Okay, we will be discussing about multiple options now. So that is our very first demonstrations out of 10 which we were discussing. What we have achieved by far, we discussed about 3 database servers. One of them is at my East US. I have a second one which is my UK South. I've got a third one which is in Central India. That's what we have done so far. The deployment mode which I selected was using Azure Portal. What different things can you do? I can deploy them using CLI as well, Bash. I can do it with PowerShell. I can do it with the ARM template as well. This time we selected the Azure Portal to deploy them. As a result, let me go back to my portal. I'm going to SQL servers here. You will see 2 of them have already deployed. One is in East US, the second one is in UK South. My third one is currently deploying. Sometimes you dismiss them accidentally and you don't know what went wrong, what's the problem, and then you want to analyze what's happening right now, the deployments and all those things. The best place to see that, go to your resource group. In your resource group, go to the deployments blade, and you will see we created the first deployment, second, the third one, which is still deploying. 1 minute 39 seconds have been passed already, and it is currently deploying all these options. So you can see these deployments may vary depending on which region you're selecting, but that's okay. My third server will also get deployed, and we will see that coming as Central India. We will verify it before our next demonstration. So you can see that my deployment just got completed. Now, if you take a look, I've got the server number 63, which is Central India. The status is available. Okay, let me go to my SQL servers. I've got 3 servers at the end of my very first demonstration. Once again, as it's a demo-based Power Packed session, we are going to the next segment here. How do you work on an Azure SQL database? So we created a server previously. Now I want to have my databases in here. And that's exactly where I want you to revisit this particular space. I was talking about the server cost is going to be absolutely nothing. So When you talk about the cost factor here, the cost will be with two different things. You can have a database specific cost, or you can have your cost associated to your SQL Elastic pool. We will be seeing both of these things. When you talk about this one, we call you have a single database which you are provisioning, or you have a pool of database you want to provision. My cost can be associated with them. Righty, let's take an example, guys. I'm taking you back to my portal over here, and this time, as part of this demonstration, I will be creating a blank database as well. I will be creating a sample database based on some sample data. I will also be doing an import database. I'm going to show you how these things actually works and how they are different from your on-prem SQL servers, the way you want to analyze them. All right, let me go in here. I'm going to my option here, and this time I'm looking for SQL databases. Let me go to my SQL databases area. Once again, a platform as a service compute option here. Okay, let me click on create, and I am creating a SQL database. Important thing, what's going to be my subscription? In which resource group am I deploying it? What's going to be the name of your database? Okay, let's call it, this is going to be DB01. Ideally, once again, should be a meaningful name, but I'm just creating it for demonstration purposes. Or I can say that's my database. It's my production database for a US East for my web app, which I've deployed. Okay, that's the name which I just specified. On which server you want to provision it, whether it's going to be in East US, a UK South, or Central India. A general thumb of rule, guys, whenever we deploy this database, ideally, you know your target audience, where it's going to be. So wherever the majority share of the audience is located, you should be seeing that region or the nearest region to that. In some cases, your hands are binded. I mean, in terms of your hands are tied, you don't have any option. For example, I'm in European Union, and because of the GDPR compliance needs to be followed, doesn't matter if my majority of chunks comes from US, East US, because of the GDPR requirements, I have to deploy it in European Union. So depending on wherever you are, I'm selecting East US. This is what I will be showing you on the same demonstration after some time. What is SQL Elastic Pool? Let's skip it at this moment. And that comes, what kind of database are we deploying over here? Let me show you some example. I'm clicking on configuring this database. So Microsoft's having the compute model. When the Azure SQL service was launched, it was having the DTU based modeling, a data transaction units. What they are the calculated compute units, a well balanced, a formulated approach between a cores and a memory ratio. So let's say I'm looking for 10 DTUs here, and the storage what I want here is somewhere around 1 gig, not more than that. This is just for demonstration. So it's telling me that's going to be my estimated cost if I'm running it 24/7 per month. Okay. You can have your basic workloads, standard workloads, premium workloads on DTU based model. Let me apply that. Only costing me $15 a month. Okay. Let me review and create. And on top of that, if you see your estimated pricing is going to revise, because previously it was for 2 virtual cores. Now you see it's $15 only. Okay. Let it get come. I am deploying this database, and the database which I deployed was using my traditional DTU mechanism, the data transaction units mechanism over there. What I'm doing next is I'm provisioning one more database. Let me go to my SQL database this time. I'm creating another one, and let's say that's going to be my database, and this is once again a production database, but I have an Android app, and that's my notification receiving database, and I want this one to be a little bit higher in terms of performance. Okay, I'm still deploying it at the East US. This time, instead of DTU modeling, I'm going with the cores. I'm looking for 2 virtual cores, and this will be having like 122 gig of storage. You can specify that, And whenever you select it, that's telling me what's going to be my estimated cost for that. Even if I go, let's say I'm only looking for 32 gig of storage over here, which is coming up as by default, somewhere around $380 per month is going to be the costing. With 2 virtual cores, you can always increase them. That's okay. You can save money with the SQL Server license hybrid benefits. That's okay. Let me apply that. And you see that's the plan which I'm using. Let me review and create. And that gives me the costing, what's going to be the estimated cost if I'm deploying it at 2 virtual cores with 32 gig of storage. Let me create it. I just created a second database over here. All right, it is working up. But when I was creating these databases, ideally, they're going to be blank initially. These are going to be the blank databases. We will verify them. In the meanwhile, this one's getting deployed. I want to create one more database. This time it's going to be a sample database. Let me click over here. What do you want to name it? Let's say GTL sample DB01. That's my sample database. Still, I'm doing it at East US. Okay. And now I'm saying, well, it's going to be on a DTU model. I'm just using it for demonstration, but that's going to have 20 DTUs. It's going to have 2 gig of storage. The estimated cost will kicks in somewhere around $30 a month here. But I'm taking you to a different place called additional settings this time. When I click here, if it's none, it's going to be blank. You can have your collision settings as well, case sensitive, case insensitive, the collision settings for your SQL Server database. This time it's going to be a sample. So my AdventureWorks LT schema will be imported with some sample records as well. So I'm creating a sample database so I can verify and we can run some queries on top of that. Let me review and create, and I'm going to create this. So let me create this. I have these 3 databases created by far. 2 of them are on a DTU model. I've got another one as a sample database. Okay. I want to do something else as well. Well, these are individual databases. They have their own compute and memory. But I have some development and testing databases as well. I don't want them to be independent, isolated with dedicated compute. They might be shared, which will save me cost, but my work can still be done. In this case, I'm searching for something called as SQL Elastic Pool. Let me create that. And I'm creating one. And what's going to be the name? I'm saying that's going to be my GTL dev test pool. So for development and testing databases, the organization confirmed we'll be putting them over here. When I configure that Elastic Pool, I can have the pool settings. Let me go with the DTU model. I'm going to have 100 DTUs down there. They will be having like 150 gig of storage. Let me apply. And of course, I'm clicking on review and create. So within the same 61 server, I am creating this pool as well. So by far, what have I done, guys? Let's take an example. Now we are saying our SQL Azure. So we have our SQL Azure database provisioned. I was having my server 61. Over there, I created a database number 1. I created a dedicated database over there as well. I created a third one as well. And then I also created a pool over here, which can contains my databases. So how it's going to look like at the end of this cycle, once you have your SQL Server number 61, I do have 3 individual databases with, of course, different computes over here. I've got these 3 created down there. And then I also added a pool here, my dev test pool. And I can create multiple databases underneath that as well. And the difference between them is going to be all these databases which I'm drawing in red are going to be sharing the same compute and storage which I assigned to the pool. So they are in the shared infrastructure. Okay, let's take a look. I was having my SQL Elastic Pool getting created. It is on the deployment state. So when you're going over here and you're saying this time you're creating a database again, let's say you're saying a new one, and I want to name it my GTL dev db01 for developers, and this time I want to put it inside my pool. So let me go, is it in a SQL Elastic pool? I'm saying yes. So the pool name comes up over here where this is going to be deployed. All right, I click on review and create, and that tells me zero cost because the cost is already associated within the pool. All right, let me create it, guys. I am creating a database, and this time I did it inside my SQL Elastic pool. It is submitting this particular deployment. And now let's take an example. What if I want to create one more database here, and this is going to be my GTL QA DB. That's for my QA resource team, and I want that to be shared as well within the same pool. Let me review and create, and I'm creating that database. I just did it. And what if you want to have another sample database for testing, but that has to be shared? So I go with the same approach. I'm creating another database here. That's going to be my GTL testing sample DB. And since it's my testing database, I want to put up on a pool, but this will be having the sample enabled from AdventureWorks LT. Let me review and create, and I'm going to click create over here. So guys, at the end of this, what do we have? We simply achieved how can you create a blank database, how can you create a sample database, and how can you import a database, both single and inside an Elastic pool as well. So if you take a look, what have we achieved over here? I created some blank databases. I added a sample database. What I haven't done is, what if I want to import a database which is already there? Let's take a look. I can do it by multiple ways. And now I'm going to show you how can we start working with that. Let's take an example, guys. I'm here and I want to import a sample database. There are multiple ways how can you do that. You can do it from SQL Server Management Studio as well. You can do it from DMA, a data migration assistant as well. Or you can do it from the portal as well. Our today's workshop is dedicated to Azure portal, not PowerShell, no CLI, no code writing. How do you do it with GUI access in there? Let's take an example. For that, I am creating a storage account. Let's go in here. And I click on create, and in this particular resource group I am creating my storage account. So let's call it GTL storage numbers, let's call it 60. That's what I want to call it. I'm putting it at East US. That's going to be geo-redundant storage, primary and secondary region. I'm going with the default one since this class is not about storage, it's about databases. Let me create it. And let's understand what I'm doing next in there. So I am creating this particular storage account. Once the storage gets deployed, I will be creating some containers underneath that. I will be uploading my database backup files over there, and we can restore it directly from the portal if I want. And we will be discussing one important aspect of that. When we were creating those SQL servers, I created 3 of them. If I go to 61, and if you see the features here, when I was talking about the functionalities, if I go to the networking segment, by default, this was no. It is not allowing Azure services to communicate this server. But 63 as well, it's set to no. But with my number 62, I specifically made this allow Azure Services Communication to yes. And now we will be seeing a difference what this option actually stands for and why we should be having it, in which scenarios you're going to use them. Okay, let me go in here. I was talking about my storage account. Now I have one storage account here called storage 60. Let me click on that. And let's take a look. This is my storage account, which does have some containers over here. All right, guys, I'm creating some containers. Let's call it my data. It's a private container, so nobody's gonna have any anonymous access here. I'm creating another one called the DB backups. Okay. Let's say I'm creating a third one for my multimedia images. I can have another one for videos. So these are empty containers which I created. Let me go to my database backups. I'm clicking on upload, and let me upload my back file or backpack file, whatever I want. So let's say on my C drive in here, I've got some files. There is a adventureworks.backpack. Let me upload it. And I'm clicking on upload. As a result, this file will be, this blob will be uploaded over here. That's done. Let me go ahead and start utilizing it. So I have a storage account. Now I want to do a database restore. What are my different available options in order to do that? So if I want to do a database restore, I'm talking about import a database. So for importing a database, regular, you were using SQL Server Management Studio import data tier, you can always do that. You want to use Azure Data Studio, you can always use that and do that operation from there. You want to go for Azure CLI or PowerShell or Visual Studio based restore, you can do that as well, no problem on that. This time I'm doing it using the portal, okay? And when I'm doing it using the portal, I have a storage account. This storage account contains that backpack file, that backup, and that particular backup is what I want to restore. Okay, so there are two services. I've got a SQL server here, and I've got my storage account here. These two services needs to communicate with each other. Let's take an example, guys. I'm here, I can go with advanced networking. We discuss it in our DP300 additional training, but as of now, I'm showing you deliberately an error and then the resolution to that situation. Let me click on 61, that's my East US. If you go to SQL databases, you already have plenty of them. Some of them are dedicated, some of them are on the elastic pool, the SQL elastic pool, some are pooled databases, some are dedicated databases. Okay, coming back to my overview segment, there is a button which talks about import a database. I want to import it. Let me click here, guys, and it's telling me, hey, this is your subscription. You want to import it, you need to select your backup first. So I already selected my Azure subscription here. The next thing I'm going to do is selecting the backup. My backup is there in a storage account which I just created. Inside it, I have multiple containers. My backpack file is available on DB backups. All right. Let me select this AdventureWorks backpack file. Clicking on select, and that's the store from where I want the database to be restored or imported. Okay. What's going to be the specifications? What if I want to put it into a pool? You can, if you want to have it on a SQL Elastic pool. What if I want to make it serverless? So in case of serverless, whenever there is a requirement, the course will automatically increase by Microsoft. Same goes with the minimum course and the maximum course. If I'm saying the maximum course will be up to 14, the minimum course is going to be 1.75. And that tells me, hey, I have the per second costing when I talk about my serverless infrastructure. Let me select it. That's what I want over here. What's going to be the credentials? Let me go with the credentials here to connect to the server, my server credentials. Okay. So I specified I want to import it. It's not going to succeed. Let me tell you the reason. I click OK. And it starts the database import, but it is bound to fail. And I'm going to tell you the reason why it is failing, what is the resolution for that, and how do we start working in that case. All right, so let's take a look. It's submitting our import request here. And in order to do that, the SQL server, the database which it is importing, it's importing from a storage account. And so far, I don't have any connection between my storage account and my Azure hosted SQL server. So after a few seconds, a few minutes, you will see this database import will fail. The reason behind that, when I go to my Azure networking, this checkbox here which says allow Azure services and resources to access this server, that was turned off. You have to turn it on in order to establish connectivity. So I will show you both. 61, it's going to be an error. Let me go on server number 62. That's where I am. And now I'm clicking on import database here. Before I do that, to show you the virtual networks area, the firewall and virtual networks, this is yes. And let me import it on number 62. So I'm saying, where is my backup? My backup is in this storage account. It's DB backups. That's my backpack file. Let me select it. What do you want? Let's say I want to create it as a dedicated database. And what's going to be the password? Let's go with the password over here. And I'm clicking OK. So I initiated 2 database imports. One will be failing, one will be succeeding. After a few seconds, we will cross-verify them. The reason for failure, because the SQL Server is set to no for the Azure Services communication. That's what we did. All right, it is working up in the background. In the meanwhile, let me go back over here. We also discussed how can we import a database. We will verify the output, and we did it once again using the Azure portal in here. That's our next set of demonstrations. The next demo talks about accessibility. You just provisioned some servers, you created some databases, you imported some databases. How about accessing them? So now we are discussing about the firewall rules, the server firewalls, what these are, and how do we work with them. Let's take an example here, guys. I've got some servers, I've got some databases. So if I go to my SQL database area, I have a SQL database here called the sample. That's my sample DB01. If I click on this sample database, I want to connect to that. I'm going to my query editor, which is an in preview feature. Okay. Let me enter my password. I can tell you I'm writing the correct password over here, but still I will not be able to connect to that. I'm gonna get an error. It's telling me, hey, do you trust this certificate? Yes, I do. But still, it's gonna tell you you're connecting to this server, but access was denied because this public IP address where you're currently connected to is not in the allowed list of IP addresses to establish connections. So by default, Microsoft Azure blocks every single thing. You don't have any external communication enabled by default. So how do I resolve it? Let me go to my databases. I can do it from 2 different places. If you're into your SQL database, currently I'm on my SQL database here. I can click on set server firewall, click over here, and let's say that's call the machine. I'm calling it a dev machine here. That's my start IP address and the end IP address. I can have the range as well. Let me save it. And I just added 1 IP address to the list. And that's a server level firewall rule. Okay, as a result, let me go back to my database. I'm clicking on query editor. Let me enter my password. So I'm entering the password over here. And boom, I'm gonna logged in. There you go. That's an in preview feature. I can do the same thing with my SQL Server Management Studio as well. That's my very first connection. I can see some sample tables. Let's take a look. I'm saying select asterisk from saleslt.customer. And let me run this query. And that's going to show me all the results in here, values coming up in there. Important thing, I just communicated with my SQL Server over here using portal.azure.com. You may have multiple tools. For example, in my machine, I also have SQL Server Management Studio. So let me open my Management Studio and I will be bringing it over here. So let's take a look. I'm opening up my SQL Server Management Studio now in order to access my Azure hosted SQL Server, that is platform as a service. Let this one get started, and I'll show you the access mechanism from there as well. We can also have Azure Data Studio. That's okay, I don't want to recover them. And now it's giving me the connectivity dialog box, and let's understand how does it work. First, it is asking me the name of the server to which I want to connect. So let me go to my database again. So this was the table we were checking accessibility to that. So let me go to my database again, and there I see the server name property. Let me copy that. This is my server name, by default accessible on port number 1433. Of course, we can change it. I'm connecting via SQL authentication as of now. We will talk about Azure AD Authentication in our next set of demonstrations. What's my username? Let's go with this one. And this is my password here. Okay. And I'm trying to connect. And it will take me in. My connection got succeeded because this public IP address I just added to my server firewall list. Okay. And you can see once you expand, you're seeing all these databases here, whatever we created, whether they were my actual dedicated databases or they were my databases in the SQL Elastic pool. I'm seeing all of them in here. All right, what is next? Well, I want to connect it with one more tool. That's my Azure Data Studio. Let me open my Azure Data Studio here. It's freely available. You can download it for Windows, Linux, Mac, and you can start working. So I want to go with our connection. So let me go to my connections area here. Let me create a new connection. That was my server name. Looking for a SQL login. Let's go with the credentials here. And a specific password, remember that, that's okay. Let me call it my server 61, and I click on connect, and boom, it's gonna get you connected over there because this public IP address we already added, and you can see it coming. You have all these databases. That is my Azure Data Studio, and you can have plenty of things over there. Run a query, create a notebook, lots of things can be done in there. So that's one thing which we were having. It's freely available. You can download this, the Azure Data Studio right from there. What I'm trying to do now, I'm creating one more connection. And this time I'm doing it with my server number 62. Okay, let me enter my user ID password here. And when I'm calling it as SVR number 62, let me try to connect, and now you'll be seeing something like, hey, this is the IP address you need to add in order to access that. That's not available on the firewall list because previously we added it to server 61, not the server number 62. Let me go over there. On the portal, I'm going to my SQL server. Let's go to number 62 over here. And on my server firewall, let me add that particular IP. That's my client IP address. I can do it from there as well. Let me save it. And I just configured that. As a result, it's not gonna ask it again. If I click on connect, you will be good to go because the IP address has already been added. As a result, you can see all these values coming up in here. If you expand the databases here, you have AdventureWorks, which I was importing. If I take you to my secondary demonstration, guys, I was importing that database here, and you see the first one got succeeded. It is still running. It's going to give you an error that you're not able to do that because it doesn't have access. Number 62 was having that checkbox turned on and the access was granted. So if I take you back to my PowerPoint presentation here, that talks about, now we understand how can we create a server firewall rule for SQL Azure, specifically when it is platform as a service. This is always at the server level, and you need to add all external IP addresses in order to gain access if you want to query, manage, monitor, whatever operations you want to perform. Okay, coming back, what we did by far, we enabled access for SQL Azure databases by adding the existing public IP support or the external public IP support. Once again, we were doing it using the Azure portal. So a quick check what we did so far. We provisioned 3 servers over there. One is on East US, another one's UK South and Central India. I've got plenty of databases underneath them. I have dedicated databases, I have SQL Elastic pooled databases, and then I enabled the access by adding the firewall rules over there. All right, coming back to our next segment and practical implementation. How do we work with the authentication and auditing purposes all together? How does these things work and start analyzing that? So this demonstration talks about how can we enable Azure Active Directory and how do we work with auditing functionality over there? Well, let's take an example there. I'm going in here. I've got these 3 different servers. I'm talking about number 61 as of now. And you will see I've got plenty of features. Currently, I was logging in using SQL authentication mechanism. Okay. What I want to do is my Azure Active Directory admin is not configured. Even if you go to features, you will see your Azure AD admin is not configured. Do you want to centrally manage the access to your databases? If you do, click on that. Now here you need to set an admin. Best practices. It could be an individual user as well, or it could be a group from your Azure AD as well. Anybody's member of the group will have access to this one using Azure AD authentication as well. So let me click on set admin. Okay. And there it comes, my Azure Active Directory. I'm seeing these groups as well. I'm seeing these users, employees as well, all those values. Let's say I'm looking for myself at present. That's my events at gtechlearn.com. Let me select that. This person will be the Active Directory admin. Best practice, we usually go for a Azure AD group and set up that as an AD admin over there. Do you only want Azure AD support? See guys, in our previous case, that error comes up because the server firewall did not allow to connect to that storage from 61 because the connectivity option was set to no. So we were bound to see that error. That's okay. Coming over here, if this checkbox is selected, only Azure AD authentication will work. If I'm saying no, my SQL authentication should also work. Let me save it. What I'm doing now, I am enabling the Azure Active Directory authentication, which I just did on server number 61. Okay. What if on my server number 62, I want to set the admin, but this time I want to go for anybody, any organizations, any group over here. Let's say I'm talking about support. So there is a data center support group. Whoever is the member of this data center support group will have access to this particular. So I just selected my data center support. Let me save it. Anybody is the member of this group will get access and will be able to log in using Azure AD. Let's try that. I did it on server number 61. So let me go to my SQL databases. I'm selecting AdventureWorks, for example. Let's say this one right over here, or maybe any of my database which is on server 61. So let's say this one in on 61, SampleDB is on 61. Let me select any one of that. And I click on query editor, and you will notice I can of course go with SQL authentication here, but I also have Azure AD authentication checked in. I click over here and boom, I'm connected because I just specified the Azure AD integration with this particular server. What if you're on Management Studio? Previously, I was logged in using GTL admin. Now let me connect to my database engine. It's the same one, but I want to go with Azure Active Directory. My user is this one. Let's go with the user ID, and that's the password. Let me click on connect and see, I'll be successfully in, but this time I'm logging in as my Azure Active Directory user or a member of that group, and I can see that. So I can enable my Azure Active Directory without any problem. Going back to my presentation here, it was talking about Azure AD integration. We set it up the Azure AD admin. I want to work on auditing on some of my servers now, another functionality which we would like to explore. So let me go back in here on my portal. Let's go in there, guys. And I'm on my server. I provisioned all these servers from scratch. Let me click on any of my server, for example, number 61. And I've got plenty of features here. One of them is my auditing. In order to turn on the auditing for the database, your server level auditing must be configured first. Let me click on configuration. Before I do that, where would I store all those logs? So let me click on that auditing and let's take an example. I will enable the Azure SQL server level audit over here, and then we'll enable the auditing for our individual databases as well. Let me enable the server level audit here. Where will you store your logs? It can be a storage account, it can be log analytics. If I further want to stream those logs, analyze on them, I can do it on event hubs as well. In my case, let's say I have a storage account. So this is whatever storage account. Let me select my subscription. This is my storage account, and that's where I want them to be stored. The retention policy is going to be 30 days till the time those logs will be there. Okay, let me turn it on. Do you also want to enable auditing if you open a Microsoft support ticket? Whatever Microsoft support was doing, you want to see that as well? You can enable that. More security. Let me click on over here. Where do you want to store it? On my storage account here. Let me say this one, and I can have a different storage account for support, but that's okay. That's where I am storing it. Let me save it. And boom, how easy that is. When you talk about turning on auditing, you configure the auditing at the server level first, specify where you will store it, your actual logs versus the Microsoft support team logs, and you can specify all these operations down there. Once it gets saved, you will be able to enable auditing at the database level thereafter. So on 61, the auditing is configured. So let me go back to my databases down there, any of my SQL databases. Let's say I've got my sample DB and I want to enable auditing over here. So when I talk about SQL Server database settings, let me scroll it down. There is a security feature called auditing. Let me click on that. What I want to work underneath that, my server level auditing is already enabled, which I already did. Now I want to enable SQL auditing for the database. Let me just do that. And where will you store the logs? Let's say it's going to be my storage account, could be different. My retention policy for the database is going to be 7 days, and I can specify all these options. If you want to go on the storage, that's okay. Let me save it. And I just enabled auditing at the database level as well. Now, important thing, when I want to try and test it, let's take a look. I'm going to my query editor. I already have my SQL authentication. I'm trying with a bad password. I know the password's not correct. Click OK. That tells me login failed. Now I'm logging with my Azure AD user. It is successful. I'm doing select asterisk from saleslt.customer. Let me do that. Okay, it is working up. Will show me the data, queries, all those informations. I'm gonna say where the customer ID between let's say 5 and 15, including 5 and 15 down there. Let me run that, and that's showing me all these records in here. Important thing, if I go to that database, and in that database I recently turned on the auditing functionality. Let me scroll it down in the security region, and I'm clicking on see the audit logs here. So let's take a look over here. On my database audit, I can see my server audits as well. I can see my database audit logs as well. Let's take a look. I was trying with GTL admin and the access was failed. You can see what query was raised against that. You have the login information, that's fine. My authentication got failed. At the same point of time, I did one execution here. Database authentication got succeeded. Then I did one batch execution here. This was my command. It was executed by this particular public IP address. This was the principal name which was used in there using the Azure SQL query editor. So you can see all these details coming up, the date and time and all. And of course, I can analyze them with my stream analytics and multiple options down there. So that was one quick thing which I was doing. I just turned on the auditing in one of my database. I enabled it at the server level. So when my demonstration says this was talking about, so what we have done with this demo, we enabled access via Azure AD by Azure AD integration, and we also enabled auditing at the server level and at the database level as well. And that is, once again, we were doing it using the Azure portal. Okay, let's go to our next scenario. All these things are interlinked together. So when I talk about next option, I want to work on SQL Azure replication scenario over here, guys. So I want to show you how do we enable replication, a single region replication or a geo-replication for your SQL Azure databases. How does it work? How do we configure it? Let's take an example. So there I am, guys, and let's take an example here. For example, on my 62, I got this database. On 61 as well, I got this database in here. One of the database which I've been exploring by far is this sample DB. And what I want to do over here, I want to create geo-replicas of this particular database at multiple locations. So I click to that database. That is on number 61. Let me click on data management, and there is an option called replicas. Let me click on geo-replicas here. I'm clicking on create replica, and let's understand. This is my subscription. That is my resource group. My primary database is sample DB01. It's currently there at East US. Does it make sense you have your replica again at East US? No, it's not. I mean, you can, but if you want to have a geo-replication, so your source server and target server cannot be the same. In my case, I have number 62 as well, which is UK South. So what I'm trying to attempt, I have a database which is in East US. I'm configuring the replication at UK South over here. If your source and your target pricing tier are same, Microsoft is guaranteeing a 5-second failover. If there is a failover, Microsoft will make your secondary the primary within 5 seconds of the actual failover. That is only when your source and target pricing tiers are same. That's fine. I selected that. Let me review and create. I'm creating this replica. That was $30. It's $37 over here in UK South because the pricing is different for that region. Okay, let me enable it. So in the meanwhile, while I'm enabling it, what my SQL replication actually does. So I have my primary database over here. Let's call it my primary. And I have a secondary database which will be created. Let me call it my secondary replica. So the important thing, this was my East US, and that's my UK South. That's where I'm deploying it. This primary database is always read-write, but the replica will always be read-only. Okay. If your source and target pricing tiers are same, Microsoft is guaranteeing a 5-second failover, and that's the SLA which Microsoft provides in there. Let's take an example. I am enabling it. Let me show you what's the process which you took over there. If I go back to my database here, let me go to my sample database. I'm clicking on replicas, and you will notice I have a geo-replica which I submitted, and it is creating. So my primary copy is on East US, and I have my replica coming up over here, which I did on UK South. Currently it is seeding. Once the seeding gets completed, it will be online and the replica state will be readable over here. We will take a look. We can have advanced failover policies as well. That's okay. I'm creating one more replica. My primary is this one. My secondary is going to be Central India. Okay. Within the same tiering settings, let me click on review and create. $30. Let me click on create over here. And I just started the submission of one more replica at a different region. So within the same segment, this was my primary. What I did on top of that, I also added another replica here, and that was in Central India somewhere. And that is also my replica, which is going to be a read-only. So this is also synchronizing the same thing. If my pricing tier is same, 5 seconds a failover policy what Microsoft applies by default. Okay, let's take an example. I just initiated that replica settings in one of my databases, which we created all from scratch. If I go back in here, let's take an example. How does it work? So when I click on the replica, I just want to make sure, so you can see the UK South is already online. That's telling me readable, no problem on that. Central India is currently seeding and that'll also be online. So you can see this is my primary database and these are my geo replicas. If you go to your SQL databases now, you will see the sample DBs. There is one which is my primary. I have a second one which is a geo replica here in UK South. I'm having the third one also provisioning, which is in Central India. That is also a geo replica. So I enabled it. Well, I want to test it. Let's take an example. Before I do that, just wants to make sure I have access to 61. On number 62, when I click on firewall settings, I already added that client IP address, but on number 63, I haven't done that yet. Let me add my client IP, save it, so that I can connect to those particular servers. Okay, coming up here, and now I want you to show, I want you to experience some of the settings down there. So this is my server number 61 over here. Okay, I want to connect to one of the database. That's my sample database here. Let me get connected now on my query editor, or maybe let me do it from there. So let me go to my SQL databases here. I've got a sample DB at East US. I've got a sample DB at UK South. I've also got a sample DB at Central India. 3 different tabs are opening up here. They are with different geographical locations. Let me connect with that. Let's go with the user ID password over here. I'm logging in. That's my UK South. Let me log in over here as well. Asking me to trust the certificate. Yes, I do. You can replace it as well. Let me do that. Now it's going with the third one. That's my Central India. Let me go to query editor. I'm keying in the password over here. That's my Central India location, and I'm connected here as well. Wants to show you something. Well, this one, I have a table. Let's call it select asterisk from sales LT dot customer. That's my table. Let me run it, and that's executing. Of course, I'm going back to my UK South. Let me go over here. I'm running the same query on my Central India region as well. Important thing is the table does exist. I can see those values coming up in here with all these locations. Great. What I want to do next, let's say on my one of my secondaries, whether it's UK South. So this is server number 62, which is UK South. What I want to do is delete from sales LT dot customer. I want to delete all the values from here. Let me run it, and you see an error. It's running that. That tells me fail to update this database because this database is read only. And that's what I was talking about. So if I go back to my servers here, let me open my primary. This was my primary. If you take a look at the replica settings, your Geo-Replicas having a status called readable. They are only the read-only databases in here. Is it asynchronous or an asynchronous? It's an asynchronous replication, which it is happening. How fast it can be? Let's take a look, guys. I'm here. What I'm doing, let me create a table here. Let me call it GTL visitors, for example. And this table contains an ID column. Let's call our visitor ID column. That's going to be integer. I want to call it identity. Okay. Let me make it a primary key here, the cluster index. I'm going to have a visitor name. Let's go with this one. A visitor city. Let's go with this range. A visitor phone as well. Let's go with this one here. Okay, that's one quick thing which I was having, and then I haven't created this table first. But what I want to select from GTL visitors, select asterisk from GTL visitors here. That's of the table. Let's see what I'm doing. That's my primary. Can I do that in secondary? No, I cannot, because the database is read only. If I run it, that tells me the table does not exist. Because it's not there in the primary, how come it's going to be there in the secondary over there? I do the same thing here. The table doesn't exist. I don't see that. That's going to be an error that tells me invalid object name GTL visitors. Okay, let's see, guys. That's my primary. I'm running it. My table got created. Even if you select, you don't have even a single record, but the table got created. Let me go to my secondary here. I'm running it, and here as well I am running it, and that tells you the table's coming up. So it is almost as real time as it can be. You created something on your primary, asynchronously it will start writing that into the secondary locations. So a couple of things which we identified from here. One, whenever you have these regions available, it could be cross regions. In my case, I have a East US, a UK South, and a Central India. My Geo-Replicas are there. We checked they are read-only. Second, when we do any changes to the primary, they are almost near real time and gets replicated to the secondary sources down there. So there was one demonstration which was talking about how do we enable Geo-Replication for our Azure SQL databases, which are platform as a service. Coming back, what we did, guys, I enabled Geo-Replication at UK South and Central India servers. My primary was US East, and we did it from the Azure portal itself. I can do it from PowerShell, CLI, ARM template. That's okay. Coming back to the next segment, guys, we are talking about the next set of demonstrations here, which talks about what is my dynamic data masking and how does it work and how do we start utilizing that. So I'm going to talk about that example, but let's understand the use case. More importantly, in most of the cases, dynamic data masking is going to be an important concept for every organization who's looking to enforce security and compliance at the database levels down there. How does it work? How do we start working with that? How do we configure it? That's exactly what we are going to see in here in order to work with all these options in there. So let's take an example. I was talking about that option, and now I will be working up with some of the commands in order to activate and start working with all these details as part of that. And how do we configure dynamic data masking as well? I'm creating a scenario here first. So let me go to my Azure portal. And let's say I've got a database here. On my SQL databases, I created one for my dev. Let's go for this dev database, which is on the Elastic pool. I'm clicking on Query Editor. And let me continue with my Azure AD. That's okay. What I'm doing over here, let's see. I am creating something. So let me create a schema here. and I want to call it sales. Let me execute that. I just created this schema. What I'm doing next, I'm creating a table over here. The name of the table is going to be sales.customers. Okay. What it's going to have? It's going to have my customer ID field. That's going to be integer. Let me make it identity. As a best practice, it'll start from here. And I'm making it a primary key with the clustered index. Okay. I'm going to go for customer name. That's going to be character. What's my customer group? That's going to be integer. I'm going to have my customer email as well. That's going to be varchar here. And I'm going to have my customer phone number as well. That's going to be varchar 15. I can have lots of details in here. Let's say this is my first table. Let me execute that. I just did it. What I'm doing next, I'm creating another table, but I want to do it with Management Studio. Okay, we can always do that. That's my Management Studio here. I've got my dev database here. I want to see whether all those changes are synchronizing or not. So let me refresh those tables once and see when I expand. I should be seeing my sales.customers, but that's my QA. I'm going to see nothing on my dev DB. That's where I was making those changes. I don't see those tables because the connectivity wasn't refreshed. So what I'm going to do next is let me refresh. I'm seeing that sales.customers in here. Let me click on new query and see what I'm doing. I'm going to create another table here. Before I do that, before I write it up, let me add some sample data here. On this sales.customers, let me edit some records. Of course, I can go for an existing table as well. I just want all of you to see everything from scratch, how the dynamic data masking works and how important that's going to be. So I edit that for inserting some quick values. Let's say that's going to be John over here. The customer group's going to be 10. Let's call it john.stale or stain whatever at abc.com. The phone number. All right, it's going to insert that and will generate an automatic number because of identity column. Let's go for Steve Jackness, for example, customer group number 20. Okay, and let's say the number is empty, it's null, I'm not specifying anything. Let me go with some more sample records here. Let's say that's going to be myself. Let's go over here. Sorry, I just clicked on a wrong key. That's okay. And let's go over there. All right, I'm gonna have one more record over there and that'll be it. So let's go for John Doe again. That's gonna be customer group number 10. Not available. And let me go ahead and save that particular record. So I just inserted some data over here. That's fine. Now I'm going to create another table here. Let's call it create a table. And that's going to be sales.cardsinfo. Okay. And let's go over there, the payment methods and the cards info. I'm going to say, what's my card ID? That's going to be integer, identity 1 from 1. Step value, seed value. Let me make it a primary key. And now I want to say the card belongs to which customer. So of course that's going to be integer and it's going to be a foreign key here, which references the sales schema. And there is a customers table, sales.customers, and there is a customer ID column, which I'm referencing. Okay. I want to have my card number. That's going to be char up to 20 characters or 30 characters, the limit. I'm going to have my expiry over here. That's going to be char once again, or could be anything. Let's say up till 8. I'm going to have my CVV. Let's say that could be up to 5 characters in here. and activate it on. I can have lots of details. Just for demonstration, let's say this is my table which I am creating. It got succeeded. Let me refresh and let's take a look. I've got a second table here which is containing some sensitive information talking about the cards, numbers and everything. That's okay, it is working up. Let me insert some sample data here and we'll take a look from there. So let me edit top 200 rows and insert some sample records, and we'll verify that information right across. And then I will show you the problem statement and the resolution. So let's say my customer ID is 1000. Okay, my card number doesn't matter. Sometimes I don't give those hyphens. My regular expression will take care of that. That's 324. CVV, whatever you specify. Okay, let me go back to the next. I'm talking about the next customer, 1001. Let's go for a proper formatting. And let's go for 326. Whatever CVVs. One customer may have multiple card informations as well. So I'm entering one last record here. Let's go for this one, and let's say it's improper. That's not even complete format. Let's go for 427, and I'm looking for this CVV. I inserted some sample records. That's okay. Now I'm gonna show you the problem statement first and then the resolution. What my problem statement is, I mean, in terms of what I want it to do. So when I talk about all these options in here, I want to work on security, roles, plenty of things down there. Let's take an example what I'm doing here. I'm in this DevDB database. I'm creating a user. Let's call it, that's my GTL demo user 01. Ideally should be a meaningful name with a password. And the password is going to be, let's go with this one. That's what I want to have. Let me create this user. I just did it. So I have this database level user now. What I want to go, I want to grant some access, wants to work on security roles and all. So let's take an example. I just created one user over here. The next thing I want to do is I want to create some access and start working with all these options in terms of secured access and creating a role. So let's take a look. I am creating a role over here. Let me call it sales reader. For example, it's going to be a custom role. In order to show you that, that's my database. If I go on programmability over here, you have multiple things. I go on security and there is roles. I already have some database roles over here, which all of us are pretty much familiar with. Okay. I'm talking about users. I created a user here with GTL demo user 01. We will quickly verify that. That's the one. Now I'm creating a role called sales reader. Let me go ahead and execute that. I just created this particular role in there. What is the next thing I'm doing over here? Let me alter that role. The name of the role is sales reader. I'm adding a member. The member which I am adding over here, I just add member. That's my GTL demo user 01. Let me execute that, only this particular statement. I altered the role. Now, what kind of permissions do they have? So let me grant them. They can select, they can only read the data on a specific schema. So that's going to be a specific schema. Which schema? The schema is sales, and I'm granting it to sales reader. So the members of this particular role will be able to read everything from the sales schema. Let me execute that, and we are going to test this access, and now we will see an actual problem. So I'm connecting. This is my same. The user is GTL demo user 01 with the password. In the options, I'm saying I want to connect to a database. The name of the database is going to be my GTL DB. So even if you see that, that's my database GTL dev DB01. Okay, let me have it here and I'm clicking on connect. So this time I'm connecting to the same database with a different user with a custom role. Okay, it is coming up and I can see only one database which is accessible. Now we will see the actual problem with this and then the need of dynamic data masking. So let's say the user says select asterisk from sales.customers and select asterisk from sales.cardsinfo and I hit run. Because the user is having read permission, I can read the entire data, no problem, that's quite normal. But these are my sensitive informations. I don't want these to be easily available just like that. So in order to achieve them, you want to implement a higher level of security. That's the situation when dynamic data masking kicks in. So let me go to my portal. On this database now, I have another feature called dynamic data masking. And I want to work with some of these. So you will see I've got the entire schema, table, column names over here. It is reading them. I want to add some mask. So my email address is sensitive. Let me add a mask here, or I can do it from here as well. I click on add a mask from the sales schema, the customers table. My customer email is sensitive. I want the email address formatting to be applied in there. Let me add this masking. I'm adding another one. On my sales schema, I've got the cards info and my card number is sensitive. I want my credit card information to be applied, or if it's a custom regular expression, you go for the custom regex in here. That's okay. That's what I want. Let me add it. Important thing, you have to save them first. When you enable the dynamic data masking, they are applicable to everybody except the administrators, because administrators, they can pretty much see everything. Okay, let me save these dynamic data maskings, which I did on these two columns. After that, I'm talking back as my admin. So this was my administrator. What if my administrator is executing the same thing? Select asterisk from cards info, sales.cardsinfo. Let me go over here. And this user's trying to see that. I'm logged in as an administrator. I can see everything, no problem. But what happens with that restricted user? The user was seeing that information. I'm clicking on execute and see, guys, my information has been masked completely and it is showing me the way it should be. It's giving me just like this. That's what I call our dynamic data masking over here. How these values should be integrated and worked across in there. We can see how can we implement the dynamic data masking. So we know the use case, and we also enabled and tested the dynamic data masking for my SQL Azure database. That was another demonstration which we created and planned in here. So what we achieved as part of that, we enabled our dynamic data masking for SQL Azure and verified the same. We did it using the Azure portal. I can do it with multiple modes of provisioning and deployment. Coming back to the next segment, guys, we are moving up with our next option, which talks about how does the query performance insights work. So in your on-prem scenarios, you used to have those query analyzers, performance tunings, lots of things in there. How does it work with SQL Azure, specifically when I say platform as a service operation over here? So we talk about QPIs, my query performance insights. Let's take an example. I'm taking you back to my portal. I've got plenty of servers created as part of today's webinar demonstrations. One of the servers having lots of databases, which I did. There is one database, let's see on number 62, there is a database which I imported that was AdventureWorks. Okay, if I click on that database, when I was importing, there was a CPU consumption, data import, data IO options in there, and you see all these values in here. What is my used space? What's my allocated space? The maximum storage size? I'm seeing all that over here. This time, I am more interested on one of the area down below which talks about query performance insights. Let me click on that and let's take a look, guys. That's going to tell me some high intensive queries, my resource consuming queries. One of the top one is query number 285. That's the logs IO, the CPU usage, the duration, how much it took, 3 executions were there. And if you want to take a look, when I click on that, that's going to tell me, hey, this was actually a bulk insert on this person.person table. And that was my consumption in terms of data as an all, and on which point of time the query took up lots of times over there. These are the time slots in which one the actual operation was happening. You can see all these things. Does Microsoft have some recommendations to resolve them? If you do, you'll be seeing them right over here. I can automate those recommendations as well. So when I talk about query performance insights, I was seeing my long executing queries based on CPU, based on data IO, or based on logs. So based on data, 364 was the highest, which was production.transaction history, and it was consuming most of my data. So I was talking about this one. If I take a look on based on logs, which one's taking the most? 285. I can see these top 5. What if it's telling me top 5 by last 24 hours? What if you want to customize them? You click on custom, and that's the place where you can have your filters. I want to see my top 10 queries only for last 6 hours based on my data. Let me hit that. You want to have average, sum, and all, and that gives me different query analytics altogether, the top 10 in here. What if you want to see some long running queries over here, and that tells me the query which took longer. So this one here, person.person, took up 1.1 minute to get it completed. So I can see all these analysis in here when you talk about platform as a service, and all these backups, all these patchings, they are completely managed by Microsoft. That was one quick thing we were having on our query performance insights. From where can we see that? What kind of query data can we expect, and how can we visualize all those filters and have those recommendations applied on top of that? So that was our demonstration, which was talking about it is a long running queries. You want to see query performance insights. How do we do that in SQL database? We just did it. On top of it, we were doing it with the help of Azure portal in here, and that's where we deployed these particular options. So once again, guys, if we talk about what we did as part of our demonstrations, we provisioned 3 servers down there. We provisioned n number of databases over there. We talked about blank database, working with a sample database, importing a database directly over there, a dedicated database. We talked about what's going to be an elastic pool based database over there. We talked about Azure AD Authentication, auditing functionality with that. What is my dynamic data masking? What is my query performance insights? So these were 10 demonstrations talking about most of the functionalities on SQL Azure platform as a service functionality. So that was what we were having as part of today's planned workshop, guys. In order you want to gain some more informations, you can see these on-demand events right from the URL, and that'll give you access, zero cost free access to our past events, which are freely available. If I take you in there, all you need to do is go to gtechlearn.com and click on demand events or the past events section over there, and you'll be right in that page where things are with the Power Platform, Microsoft Azure, Logic Apps, Dynamics 365. You can directly watch them right from there. These are some of our past events which are available. Once again, thank you very much for joining this event in here. Now, let me quickly open the questions from here. I'm opening up the chat. Now, when you do that, let's have your questions on the chat or from different channels. Let me answer the questions which I can do when we have these times. So your questions now. All right, got a question, how different it is from SQL Managed Instance. So SQL Managed Instance is 99% same as my SQL Azure platform, is the on-prem systems that's managed by Azure, but that's more compatible towards SQL infrastructure as a service or on-prem situations. Can we migrate our SQL Server VM to Azure as a SQL database server? Yes, you can, and that is known as SQL Server Infrastructure as a Service options over there. Multiple questions. Guys, the entire session is getting recorded. You will be having access to the recordings with you, no problem. Coming up, another question, how different this is when you talk about deploying a database with Cosmos DB. So Cosmos DB is a all different giant altogether. So that's for non-relational data with the multiple database options over there, SQL API, Apache Cassandra Spark. You talk about table structures, graph, Gremlin graph, non-relational databases. That's for SQL Cosmos DB, which is a global turnkey solution out there. This is towards our RDBMS. How do we work with all these options when we talk about working with Azure settings? You can configure, get your connection strings copied and distributed to developers. They'll be able to use them as they were using it for any of the on-prem situations. Alrighty, perfect. So that was what we were having in this particular session, guys. Important thing about that, and the recordings will be placed at the events page. You'll get an email as well from the team. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining the session. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great evening.